Everyone. Hi everyone. We're back with you again this week on the live teaching from here in Palm Beach Gardens with the Gospel Revolution. We want to make sure that if you need more information, you can go to gospelrevolution.com. We have a lot of information on there, and we're testing out a couple of different formats. I'm going to be actually rehearsing again some of the things that we shared with you right at the end of the last teaching session. Now, the reason we're going to do that is because I've talked to 3 people who told me that they didn't really get it because I think of the interruptions that we had in the last one. And we're also trying a new format in just coming to a certain point and doing on about 18 to 20 minutes. I think that's going to be much easier for you to be able to share with your friends and to archive this and be able to go back and click on it once it shows up on the app, and it will be on the app very quickly. Nardos Kabidi takes care of that. So make sure that you download the app so that you have access to it. Now, the title of this session tonight is called No Forgiveness Under the New Covenant. Now, there really is no forgiveness under the new covenant. Now, that's either the worst news you ever heard, or maybe there's some good news in there. Because the gospel comes out of the new covenant, and the gospel means the gospel means good news. So if there is no forgiveness under the new covenant, we need to see what the good news is about that. A couple of things that we're going to touch on, and we'll get right into this, is the difference between forgiveness under the old covenant and forgiveness under the new covenant. The thing that we know about the old covenant is that forgiveness of sin never really took place. Everything that we read about it under the Old Testament was that the blood of bulls and goats actually covered sin. They did not, the blood of bulls and goats did not take away sin. There would have been a type of forgiveness in the fact that it was covered. And that's what the entire Old Testament is about. It's about covering things. You have women in coverings. You have the covering of the sins under the First Testament by the offering of the blood of bulls and goats. Paul has said here in Hebrews, where we're covering, this is where we're getting our information from, is the book of Hebrews. Paul made it very clear that the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. So we know that the issue is that sin needed to be taken away or done away with. Now, many might say, now, Mike, we just don't know where the Bible talks about sin being done away with. Well, we do. We know exactly where the Bible talks about sin being done away with. And sin has been done away with. Under the First Testament, though, sin could only be dealt with in the aspect of it being covered. Now, because of that, Paul says that is what made it so very clear that a new covenant was needed, because that the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. And that term sin literally means to take away sin altogether. There's very telling verses in the process of this about what the blood of Christ did. Now, the wonderful thing about the new covenant is that the new covenant is the forgiveness of sin. But you see, the new covenant is not the forgiveness of sin on a daily basis. The new covenant is not the forgiveness that you request sin per sin, or at the end of the day if you're a Baptist, or at the end of the week if you're a Catholic. This is not the issue that the gospel teaches us about the forgiveness of sin. You see, forgiveness of sin is something that was looked for and longed for many thousands of years. The prophets foretold of a time when sin would be taken out of the way, that sin would just be literally obliterated off of the face of the earth. I know many of you are asking, well, what do you call this stuff that's happening here? Well, there's crime. There's all kinds of things that you can call it. But you see, sin is something that exists between God and man. If indeed, as the gospel declares, that God and man are now one entity, you see, there can't be something called sin between God and man. Why, Mike, is there no sin between God and man? Because there's no between. God and man are now one entity. Remember, Jesus made that incredible prayer before his crucifixion. He prayed, Father, I pray that they may be one with us, even as they may be one, even as we are one. Now, that takes out all prepositions of being anywhere near or around Christ or God. In fact, the only preposition that exists is in. We are in. He is in us. We are in him. There is no distance. So sin is something that exists between two entities. You see, I could sin against you because we are two different persons, even though we are one in Christ. But the fact of it is that we and God, you and God have been made one. So there's no space between where that sin can even exist. Jesus made this very clear, or Paul made this very clear about Jesus when he was talking about this wonderful thing that Jesus did. I never will forget when this verse caught my attention the first time. He said in chapter 9, verse 15, and for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death, for the redemption of transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Now, the thing that's clear here in these verses in Hebrews, and we've gone through a lot of context with you pertaining to this subject, and that is that the shedding of the blood of Jesus dealt with the sins that were under the first testament. Now, let's take this exactly for what it says. It says that the blood of Christ dealt with the sins that were under the first testament. So what's going to deal with the sins that are under the second testament, or the New Testament as we call it? You see, that is the good news about the gospel. There is no such thing as sin under this covenant. You see, sinning under this covenant would be such a strange thing that Paul had to use a lot of very powerful descriptive words to explain what it would be like if there is such a thing as sin under this covenant. And we find that in chapter 10. We're staying with the same subject. If you want to know where it is talking about the blood of bulls and goats, and that they could never take away sin, that's in chapter 10, in verse 3 and 4 and 5, down through there. And then in verse 14, he says, for by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. Now we also know who has been sanctified. The fact of it is, he is determined here just in about 3 verses before this, that everyone has been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. So we have this perfection now. What is perfection? Perfection means you can't sin. You're not even corruptible. You're not corruptible because the first Adam was capable of corruption. You see, you're not even capable of it. That is the good news of this covenant. You see, Christianity was developed out of a false persuasion that someone on this side of the cross could be corrupted or could be a sinner. So we've developed a massive, really institution that is trying to deal with something that does not exist. That is the truth about Christianity. is that it is dealing with a problem that no longer exists. Now, they first off have to convince you that it does exist. But you see, the teachings that Paul gave us convinces us that sin does not exist anymore. This understanding is so powerful. Now, let's read through the words that Paul said about the issue of sin under this covenant. Now, remember, Paul's already said, the writer of Hebrews has already said, Jesus died for the sins that were under the first testament. Then it has told us that he has perfected us forever, that he indeed has brought us into perfection. He brought the entire human race into perfection 2,000 years ago. Now, Paul sets up a scenario. So what if sin takes place under the New Testament? What if somebody were to be able to sin under the new covenant? He says in verse 26, for if we sin willfully, and this is where that I really like where people get hung up. They say, oh, well, it's a willful sin. Do you know of any sin that you could sin that is not willful? For if we sin willfully after that we receive the knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sin. You see, it says just earlier that Jesus and his sacrifice was once and for all, and that his sacrifice was for the sins that were under the transgressions that were under the first testament. Now he's telling us if anybody does sin under this covenant, under this new covenant, he says there remains no more sacrifice for sin. There is no sacrifice for sin under this covenant. I remember hearing this read, and of course the emphasis was placed on, well, if you sin willfully. Well, I got to make sure I don't sin willfully. I got to make sure my will is not involved in it. So we came up with all kinds of what sin might possibly be. We came up with all kinds of prescriptions for any kind of sin other than a willful sin. But it was a song and dance that we went through. These things were not real. Let's read through what Paul had to say here. He said, there remains no more sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation, which shall devour the adversary. You say, oh, Mike, see there it's talking about hell. No, that's not talking about hell. It's talking about the scenarios that took place in the Old Testament. Remember the fire, remember the fiery indignation that God showed at Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember all of those situations where that's how God dealt with sin. This isn't talking about eternal judgment here at all, because eternal judgment and judgment after this life was never spoken of in the Old Testament whatsoever. It simply is not there. So when he's talking about the fiery judgment, that would be the only thing that's waiting. You see here in this book of Hebrews, Paul says, for we have not come to the mount that might be touched, that burns with fire. So we have a context for this fire. It's not hell fire. It is the fire that is spoken of in the book of Hebrews about Mount Sinai, and also the instances in the Old Testament where sin was judged by fire. He says, which shall devour the fiery indignations, which shall devour the adversaries. He that despised Moses' law. Now see, we're getting a comparison here. He's saying, now let's compare this with sinning under this covenant and sinning under the old covenant. He said, he that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. Of how much sore punishment shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and counted the blood of the covenant, wherewith he was sanctified as an unholy thing, and hath done despite to the Spirit of grace. Folks, whenever we say that there's even a possibility to sin under this new covenant, you're doing despite to the Spirit of grace. You're trotting underfoot the Son of God, because we have read in these chapters in this same book what the Son of God has done for us. He has taken away sin. He did something that the blood of bulls and goats could not do. He died for the transgressions that were under the First Testament. What does that mean? That means there are no sins under this testament. You see, the first Adam was corruptible. He was capable of sin. But you are now incorruptible, just the same as you are immortal. You are immortal. Now, we want you to go on and give us some comments about these statements that you're hearing. There's plenty of places to do that. You can like, you can love, you can make all kinds of comments about this. And we want to understand what you've heard when you have heard this teaching. We want you we want you to really get involved in helping others to understand this powerful understanding that there are two covenants. One could only cover sin. The new one did away with sin. Therefore, under this covenant, there is no such thing as sin. Did you get it? We hope that we covered all of these points for you in a way that it is understandable. We're going to pick up right here again. The next time, you're going to find out some things about the issue of faith and us not drawing back unto perdition, which are the verses that come after this, and then going into Hebrews chapter 11. It's very, very powerful. We love you so much, and the understanding of this gospel will free your mind and your heart to live deliberately, to be able to live without guilt and without shame, and to live in a capacity to make your decisions based on something so powerful that's on the inside of you. You can trust yourself. You can trust your own heart, because Jesus is Lord.
Thank you so much for joining us this week. Just wanted to let you know that as we continue to do these, we want to do topics that are relevant to you. So if there's anything you would like to see for Mike cover in the future, feel free to write it in the comments below, and we will be sure to look through those and see what we can do for you in the future. Thanks. As always, share, comment, like, engage with us. We love to see this, and we want to hear from you. Whatever's been impactful for you and whatever has really hit home, please feel free to make a comment of that. We'll see you next week. Same time. We're doing this from the Gospel Revolution page now, as opposed to Mike's personal page. So just continue to look forward to seeing us here. See you next week. Thanks, everyone.